We try to be the wife we think our husband wants us to be. We try to be the daughter we think our mother and father want us to be. And we try to be the mother that we think our kid would like, without really knowing who we are inside.
Thank you for tuning into another episode of Unwritten. Today I have the amazing Marjorie Cutting here. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. Great.
And our story we connected a few years ago with photography
Right.
because you needed a photo for your art.
Yes, I needed a headshot.
You needed a headshot,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And so, not to bring up your age, but
That's okay.
what's amazing about you is that because we all think that we have all this time, right? Like, oh, we can do something tomorrow or
Yeah.
we'll do it later and all that stuff. And here you are in your 90s creating art still and growing and questioning and you're still on your path.
Yes, I just never stopped moving on, I guess. I when I was born in 1933, the same year that Hitler became chancellor in Germany. And so the next few years, up until I was 12, was really affected by World War II. And that really affected me a lot, for all the bombing on London and everything. We children spent a lot of time in shelters. Education was messed up and everything. So, it was a scary time. If you had bombs dropping on you, and you could see the rockets that they sent over, and you wonder if they'd stop above you and drop on you. And it was a scary time. And as a child, I remember I didn't really express that I was scared. I was the oldest. I have a sister, and she was always upset, and crying. And so I kind of one was being in charge with her and having to look after her because, a lot of the times my father would be working in London and I wouldn't see much of him except, in the evenings. And then my mother, when she started, had to go out to work during the war. Then I had a key on a string around my neck so that when I came home from school, I could let myself into the house. And so my sister and I would be there on our own for a little while. And that is really scary for a kid, especially when there's a war going on and you don't know what's going to happen. And so I think in those years, I suppressed a lot of my feelings, and it took me years to begin to realize that, you know, I I needed to change how I was thinking and doing, and I did a lot of things, and it was really when my marriage broke up, when I came to America and my marriage broke up, that I really had to face myself. I couldn't blame. In the beginning, I was blaming my husband, but then I realized I had to look at myself as well and realize that I needed to do some work on myself to understand, my emotional my inner life and do something about it. And it was through painting. And what I actually did, I started painting my dreams. I had a vivid dream. I remember a really vivid dream that I never understood. And but it was one of those vivid dreams that stay with you, you never forget. And I was going on a retreat, so I took my paints with me and paper. Thought, well, it's one of those silent retreats and I couldn't talk to anyone, so I'll paint. And I painted this dream, and there was this black figure sitting in the entrance of a cave looking out onto green fields with sheep in the pasture below. And so I painted that dream. And then started in a journal, I started dialoguing with the dream, asking questions of that figure. Why are you in this cave? why don't you go out into the fields and visit the sheep? And I'd be writing this down, what was coming into my head, what I was asking. And while I was doing that, I would start getting answers in my head, answers to this question. And I would end up at the end of the day with another picture in my head, which I would then paint. And I'd continued this session. It was an eight-day retreat with the Jesuits, so it was pretty strict and it was really silent. And so each day I did that. I painted the picture, dialogued with it, and then it went on. And I ended up with 8 paintings. And at the end of the week, and it was like a sudden light went on in my head, and I suddenly understood that this was showing me my journey, my inner journey, and these were the things I had to deal with, going on. But it was just like a revelation, you and I painted that last picture, and so I've used those as a basis for a lot of my art. Sometimes similar, I repainted them because I'd only painted those on kind of computer paper, not
Whatever
really.
you had at
Yeah,
the
they were just kind of sketches and that. And so that was the basis for how I have developed my painting and that over the years, all other kinds of things going on in my life. But that was what was going on in the back of my mind. And
So you took your divorce and the separation and became an artist.
well, I was always an artist. I went to art school when I was 13. In England, we have different times of the ages. At 11, you take an exam to go to a grammar school if you want to go on to college. I didn't want to do that. I knew I could take another exam at 13 and go to an art school because I wanted to paint. My father's an artist too, and so I took a scholarship at 13 and went to an art school. It was a high school, but it was dedicated to art. And I stayed there until I was 17. Then I needed to go out to work. I could have gone on to, more college work, but I decided I needed to work because our family wasn't very wealthy. So I started applying for jobs in the theater because I was interested in the theater and costumes and that, and got my first job with a company that was from Ireland, run by Tyrone Guthrie, and they were presenting 3 plays during the Festival of Britain. That was in 1951. And I got my job as assisting the designers. And my first experiences, dealing with actors and designing costumes and making them fit and everything. So it was the beginning of my journey in the theater. Yeah.
That sounds like every young woman's dream
Yeah.
to,
Yeah. It was,
be artistic and then behind the scenes, but also part of something larger.
yeah. Yeah. It was teamwork. It was the thing that comes out of it. You're working on a project together as a whole team. There's people making props, there's people, making costumes, there's people making wigs, and then you have the dancers learning their parts, the choreographers, and everybody's working together. And in the final thing, there's a day when the curtain opens and everything has to be ready and done, and the show goes on.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, it's kinda interesting that you ended up in Baraboo with the circus town and all the costumes that are
Yeah,
right next
yeah,
door even.
yeah. It was, and when I first got here, I'd had a business in San Diego, and I had the remnants of it. I still had costumes to sell and that, so I rented a little space above the pharmacy and had a business there for a couple of years. But the very first, the Paul Fritsch, who was the landlord there, said to me, There's a show going on at the Ringling, and they need someone to design the costumes. This is when I had just arrived in Baraboo. I knew nobody, and so I said, "Okay, I'll try out for that." And I went and met the man at the university who was in charge of that, and eventually got the job to do the costumes for that first show for the Ringling Theatre, which was the reprise of the original play that was there, Lady Luxury. Well, it was put on in like 1915 or 1918, I can't remember exactly. And so I worked on those costumes and got to know all the local actors in the process. So I got to know a lot of people in Baraboo very fast, by doing that show.
And what brought you
To Baraboo?
from San Diego?
Oh, from San Diego. Well, my son went and married a Madison girl.
Oh, okay.
And so they were living here, and I was retiring. I had closed my business and I retired. And so I decided to come to Baraboo where they were and, uh, you know, be with my family and my grandson and that.
Yeah.
Just a family reason. Yeah.
And you stayed because you obviously made family here, correct?
Yeah, I made a lot of friends here, and I also liked the area. I like the small town, after London or San Diego. It was a nice small town, easy to walk around and get to places easily. Um, and I found there's a lot of artists here, a lot of musicians, a lot of authors, and it was just a nice community to get to know. And I just enjoyed it. Just put my roots down here, shall I say?
Yeah.
Because I'd traveled a lot through my life, so I put my roots down here.
Says a lot about Baraboo that this was the place that you decided to stay.
Yeah, I know. I don't know. It was the people mostly because of the people I liked. I liked the place. Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit more about, you know, those 8 days that you had in silence, because that seemed to spark something in you that you still do today. Because we were talking before we started that you just finished a painting
Yeah.
and you're still painting.
Yes.
So, what you said you had a revelation. What was the revelation?
Well, it was not so much a revelation as just like it was like light turned on in my head, and I was able to think differently. In fact, what happened, I noticed. I noticed about myself that when I went to the library, I started looking on different shelves for different books to the ones I usually read. I'd been reading books about World War II and, you know, mystery books and things like that. And suddenly I was looking for spiritual books. And there was a lot going on when this happened, especially with um, the kind of the changes that were going on with the Vietnam War at the time. And there was a priest called Daniel Berrigan who was saying things and doing things that seemed unusual, for a priest to be saying and doing. And so I was interested in what he was doing and started reading his books. He was a poet, and he wrote a lot of books about, his spirituality. So I started reading those books, and then he suggested other authors. And one of the authors he suggested was Thomas Merton, who was a priest, who was a Trappist monk, and whose his order was a silent order, but he was a writer, and he'd been told to write this book about his life and why he converted into Catholicism and becoming a monk. And I read that book, and again, that was like another revelation. Um, Seeing that person, how they changed their life, how their life changed, and I could see correspondence in me. I was beginning to change in my thinking and what I was reading, what I was doing. It was just a very gradual process. It wasn't, it was like the light got brighter and brighter, and I began to realize more and more about myself, what needed to be pulled out and looked at.
Yeah.
um, yeah, it was. After the 8-day retreat, a year later, I went on a 30-day silent retreat in the same place. This is in California, and that was a challenge. 30 days not being able to talk to anyone else except my spiritual director who I had. And it was, again, it was I don't know if you know anything about the Jesuit retreats, but what you're doing is you read the scriptures and you put yourself into the scripture and imagine yourself actually being there and try to deal with how you're feeling about it and all of that. So that and that again was helping me get deeper and deeper. And I was painting pictures at the same time, and a continuation of dealing with all these things that kept surfacing. Not my relationship with my mother, or my father, my relationship with my husband who I was divorced from, and or my child, my child, and and all the other things that happened in my life. I was being able to look at them in a new light. It's hard to explain. It's you know,
I mean, what it's very reflective, right?
yeah.
But what was reflected back at you?
I guess the thing that I had to look at myself, and I guess one of the big things I learned was not to judge people.
Mm.
You know, it was so easy to sit in church and look at somebody in church and start thinking about, things about them that could be better or changed, and really then realize you're doing it, and say, oh, I can't do that. That's I just know that's not right. I don't even know that person. How can I sit here and judge them, from this?
And so what I'm assuming though that also happened is you stopped judging yourself, right? Because
Yeah,
once you stop
that's been a big
self-criteria.
struggle, stopping judging myself and criticizing myself. And yeah, you get to this age and it's stop caring too much about what other people think. And I think that was what I know, when I'm painting, I try to show that in my paintings, that in the beginning of our life, we're trying to be what we think other people want us to be. We try to be the wife we think our husband wants us to be. We try to be the daughter we think our mother and father want us to be. And we try to be the mother that we think our kid would like, without really knowing who we are inside. And it's only when you come then to a real trauma in your life, like for me, it was going through the divorce in a strange country with my family far away, that I had to deal with that and all that came up from that. That is like the dark night of the soul. But once you go through that and come out on the other side, it's like you're a little more whole. You're not all these different roles. You're coming together as a more whole person. And then the final phase is where you can get rid of all of those veils and get rid of all of those clothes, those ideas of trying to be what you want, other people want you to be, and then you can just be yourself. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean the same thing happened to me with my divorce. It started about 3 years prior to the divorce. I
Mhm.
just went dark, and
Mhm.
it was such a dark place to be in, and I kept looking for somebody to rescue me.
Yeah.
But what I needed to do was rescue myself.
Mm.
So now it's been 3 years since the divorce, and I've learned to be that person for myself.
Yeah.
So I totally understand what you're saying
Mm.
because now once you find that within yourself, you stop you stop caring about what other people you stop searching
Right.
outside.
That's right. You realize you have to do it yourself.
Yeah, there's nobody that's gonna.
Nobody understands it, what you're dealing with, you know. Yeah. It's I wasn't raised in a church or anything as a kid. Um, I but the strange thing is, I guess when I was about 15, I started going to the local. There was a church meeting for kids. What do you call it? A club. Kind of a club for teenagers. And I started going to that because a friend of mine went to it, and that was my first um, experience of having anything to do with a church. And it was a uh, Episcopal church in England, and I got confirmed into the church. I still didn't really understand what was going on, but it just seemed like a good place to be. And and I did all the things that you do when you get confirmed into the church, um, and then when I started working, though, that all fell away, and I didn't think about church anymore. And again, when I was 14, I got very ill with meningitis, and there was a point where it was a matter of whether I was going to live or not. But I remember this day, I'd been really ill for about 2 weeks, and I suddenly found myself floating up in the corner of the room I was in. I was in an isolated room because of meningitis, and I found myself up in the corner of the room looking down at my body in the bed, and I was making a decision. Did I want to leave and go out of the window, which I was next to, or did I want to get back in my body? And I remember making that decision that I was just started art school and I wanted to do the art. So I made the decision to get back in the body rather than leave, because that's what I had wanted. That was my desire to do art. So I went back in my body, and I always think of that as another decision I made in my life, clear decision. So things like that would happen occasionally, but basically the divorce and following the painting painting what I was thinking, painting my ideas, trying to describe that journey, is what a lot of my art is about. Not all of it, but a lot of it. Yeah.
And prior to you going to this church, what was your idea of God or source, and how has it changed?
I,
How did religion change you in that
I
aspect?
didn't really have any idea of God that I can think of. Um, it just wasn't one of those things we ever discussed or talked about at home, except my mother always had a saying, that she'd be somewhere, God willing.
Oh yeah.
It's just a normal expression. But no, nothing else. That our family was, you can get married you get baptized in church, you get married in church, and then you get buried in church. There's nothing else in between.
Mhm.
you know. But, um, and I think for me, it was when I finished reading that Thomas Merton book, I thought, I need to really make a decision here. And I went out to a local church, a Catholic church, found a priest and started talking to him about it. And he asked me how I had come to this decision to go and talk to someone in the church. And I realized it was through books, through reading these spiritual books I've been reading. So he went on teaching me through books. And eventually I decided to join the church and became baptized into the Catholic Church. And at the time, the church had just been opened by John Paul II, who'd opened the window for the Vatican II. And so there was a lot of changes going on in the church, and it was much more open. And I got involved in the charismatic movement in Southern California and with the healing ministry. And I also became a second order Carmelite, which is we'd meet once a month in the Carmelite monastery and study meditation and study the scriptures. And so this whole process was a learning experience for me, more about the spiritual life, more about learning how to meditate, um, learning about the New Testament, and all that learning, and then praying for people for healing. We were a group, and we would lay on hands and pray for people for healing. And then a lot of my art I was doing for the movement. I would make these huge banners for the churches, for conferences and things like that. I mean, really big, filling a whole proscenium. So this, my art was involved in all of this still. So it was, a reciprocal thing. And then gradually that went on for many years doing retreats. I worked on retreats and involved people in art in the retreats. um, and things like liturgical dancing.
What is that? Is that like the Sufi, like
No,
twirling and stuff,
it's
or what is?
I partnered with a friend, and she loved to do the liturgical dancing and do groups, and they would interpret certain scriptures just dancing on the altar at certain times and or at retreats. It's a way to get people involved in moving and understanding themselves better. Just
Mhm.
uh, movement and art, are all spiritual journeys, I think.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I
So,
agree.
so my life's been a mixture, all of that kind of thing, and all of this is going on at one end, and then at the other end, I when I was in England, I had toured for 8 years with the theatre, with ballet dancers and actors and opera singers and that, and toured all over Europe. And I got to the age of 25, and I was just getting tired that I had no time to meet people permanently for friends. I had a couple of friends who I shared an apartment with in London. So as I traveled, I go back and forth, but I never made any real other friends, because I was always traveling. I'd be 2 weeks here, and then we'd move on to the next place, another 2 weeks. So at the end of 8 years, I just really got to a point where I just wanted to change. And I quit my job with the ballet company I've been working with and was in London, and I thought I wanted to work with children. So I go to the Save the Children Fund and said, I'd like to have a job, working with children. What do I do? So she said to me, well, what degrees do you have? And I said, I don't. I can sew and I can paint, but I don't have any degrees. So that was my problem, So at that time, because those of us who are 25 in that age range had our education so disturbed by World War II that the University of London and the London School of Economics came up with a way for us to apply for university, and go in and take a degree, take our degrees. So I thought, well, I didn't even really know what a university was. So I said, okay. So I go along, trotting along to the university and fill out the forms and write the essay and why I wanted to do this, and then take my IQ tests and then go for interviews. And I got accepted. And again, that was another big change in my life. I'd always, I wasn't dumb. I'd always been a reader and knew what was going on in the world. But I tell you, that first year in the university was like another revelation. It was like my mind just opened up to all the other possibilities in the world. And the the department I was in, we were studying, social economics, social um, social education, social psychiatry, social politics, and all of these things, and doing our seminars and having to write essays and having to present papers at seminars. And I'd never ever done anything like this before in my life. So it was, but all the other people were the same age as me, or people who'd had jobs. Like one member in the group I was in was a lingerie designer. Somebody else had worked on atomic physics, So there's all these people who'd come from different branches of life, but wanted to learn, to get their degrees to go on and do something else. So it was very exciting, very stimulating educationally, and it really stimulated my mind. And I eventually ended up 4 years there and got my teaching degree. And that's when I got married and got pregnant, and my life changed again.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Because my husband then wanted to do, who I'd met at the university, he wanted to do his doctorate. And there were only two places in the world working on what he was working on, which he was a biochemist, and one was San Diego, and the other one was Helsinki. We happened to have a very bad winter that year in England, so we chose San Diego.
Yeah.
So these choices just happened. Nothing was. I always look at it. My life is my unintended life. We just went with what presented itself at the moment.
Yes.
And this is what happened. Yeah.
And so you never got remarried, or did you?
No,
Just wasn't
that
was it
was
something you wanted, or
um no. I was open to it, but it just didn't happen.
mm,
Just didn't meet the person.
yeah,
Yeah.
because you didn't again, you healed from you didn't need a person per se.
Yeah, I think that by that time, yeah, I probably was more, much more independent and able to care for myself and look after myself and not need someone to be with. But it can get lonely at times, and but that's okay. I was a person who didn't mind being quiet and being, having done 30 days silent retreat. I
Yeah.
was used to that kind of thing. Um, it didn't affect me, but I after my divorce anyway, I had the opportunity to buy a San Diego costume company.
Wow.
I'd never done business before in my life, but I had worked with them for a couple of years, and they wanted to retire, so they sold the business to me. And so while I did that, and then my sister and her husband, who'd emigrated to Australia, came and joined me in California in the business. And then eventually my parents, who my father retired, and because both of their children were in San Diego, they decided to come to San
Oh,
Diego.
okay.
So my family kind of gathered together, and so that was a big change again. These different. It's like the life was flowing different ways at different times, and so and also at that time, I started working to get my master's degree because when I first came to
He
when
really
I
likes you.
when I first came to California, I couldn't teach. I couldn't use my teaching credentials because I wasn't a citizen. So I started looking to where I could get my credentials, what I needed to do to get my teaching qualifications and get my citizenship so I could teach. And so that was a period too when I was doing all of that, trying to figure out the system, the educational system here so I could get into it. And I eventually ended up getting my master's in special education. So,
I don't think I knew that. If I knew that, I don't remember that. So that's really interesting.
yeah, so I eventually got my citizenship and eventually was able to teach. And so I spent probably not too many years because by then I was getting older and older, things had been delayed for this. And um, so I was able to teach in San Diego for about 10 years. I guess I worked with special ed. But again, special ed is a lot of the children are very artistic. So I would use a lot of my artistic talents to help them with it. But I still, in my weekends and evenings, I still worked with the local theater groups, local dancers, and, you know.
Creating
So I
costumes?
stayed either creating costumes or just working, in a theater with a show, just working as a dresser or something like that, just to be around the theater.
Hmm.
And yes, I did. I designed and made costumes for different ballet groups. I was I was pretty expert in doing ballet costumes because I'd spent most of my years working with dancers, you know, some with actors and opera singers, but mostly dancers. Yeah.
And what is, I don't want to say what's next for you, but, in the last 10 years, what's been the biggest, be- because where I'm going with this is that we hit a specific age. Let's say it's, okay, I hope I live till 80, right? And then you hit 80. And then you're like, well, I guess I'm just going to keep
Yeah,
on
that's
because you're healthy.
yeah.
You're obviously very intelligent and you're still creating.
I
I'm not sure the question I'm asking, but I would love to hear your insight.
I like to get out and meet people. I like my quiet times, but I also like the stimulation of being in groups and meeting people. And so I do write. I write, but I'm not a writer, but I write because I just enjoy writing. And I've belonged to several writing groups over the last few years. And so I combine that with my painting. And at the moment, I finished one graphic novel, my first attempt at a graphic novel, which I called There's a Dragon in My Basement, which again reflects the beginnings of my spiritual journey when I was um, living in the attic in this book. I live in the attic, and there's a dragon in the basement. So the attic represents my intellect, and the basement represents my emotions, and there wasn't any connection between them in the beginning. And so the story is based on that dream I'd had with that dark figure in the cave. I decided that was my soul. And so in the graphic novel, I come to rescue my soul, to get my soul out of that dark cave, is the way it goes. But I don't want to deal with this dragon in the basement. So the first part is healing the heart, getting a new heart at the end. And then at the end of the story, because I have a new heart, I now have the courage to go down in the basement to get the dragon out. And so I've just completed the second part of my second graphic novel, where I get the dragon out of the basement and we go flying to the seven caves of wisdom, which are dealing with those different emotional aspects of life, relationships with my mother and different things like that going on, relationships with myself and how I felt bound and how I get unbound. And so that, and all of them, I talk about the shepherd that has guided me, and I've always felt that through all my life. There was a guide, a shepherd, that guided me, and so it's Jesus if you want it to be, or it's whoever you want it to be, But there's somebody who's holding my hand and helping me. Yeah. So it's my life's pretty mixed up, you know. But that is the basically underneath all of everything I did is that journey just taking me through all these aspects and trying to healing myself, healing myself in how I relate with other people and, how I relate to my work, how I relate to my art.
I feel the same. I feel that my journey here is to heal, and that through my own healing, whatever that is, I'm helping other people heal
Mm,
as well, because we are all united on a spiritual, energetic
yeah,
level
yeah,
if you so choose to
right.
heal. I think that's been my biggest lesson in the last couple of years is that I can't force anybody to
No,
heal,
you can't.
and that energy that goes out trying to help other people
Right.
needs to be it's best served in here,
Yeah,
and then, the right people come.
that's it. The right people come or the right moment comes for the change. You know, i- it's not planned, it's unplanned.
Right. Yeah.
Like, when I got to 90, when I had my 90th birthday, I said to my son, I need a 90th birthday party. So he created a birthday party for me here in Baraboo, and a lot of my friends were there. And because I'd never really had a birthday party through my life, because my birthday is 5 days after Christmas. So I used to end up having half the remains of the Christmas cake for my birthday cake or something like that. Uh, So I'd never really remembered having a party as a kid or anything. So I wanted one for my 90th birthday party. And then I thought to myself, now I'm 90, so I got about another 10 years to live. A lot of people in my family live to a good age. So I figured I've got 10 years and I can do with what can I do with that? And I thought, well, that's when I started writing the graphic novels and started trying to do something that explained, my life.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And with your 90th birthday celebration, did you have any regrets for not celebrating yourself sooner?
No, I don't. I look back on my life. I don't have any regrets of the things I've done.
I
I
kind of
think,
figured that was the answer after.
yeah, sometimes I look at my marriage and think I could have done better. From my part, I could have done better in my relationship there, but I didn't know how.
Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't know how to do it, and I didn't have family around to talk to about it, and so that made it difficult.
Yeah. And I do think we end up exactly where we're supposed to be.
Yeah, that with the marriage, as you say, it was really when it's really dark. I had one friend who was a Mormon, and I didn't know I had no one to go to talk to except her. And she was somebody I was in business with sewing, to do with sewing. So it was really strange. But I went to her one day because I was just feeling pretty desperate in a dark place. And I just poured all my feelings out to her. She just sat and listened. And I said all these terrible things about my husband and how bad he was, and all these things that were the problem. And she just listened, and then I went back home. I went home, I sat on my couch, and I thought I just sat there, in the dark, and suddenly it was like God put a mirror in front of me, and every single word I had said against my husband, I had to turn it around and say it to myself that what I was saying about him was really about me,
Yeah,
you
that
know?
hits hard.
And it was like I was crying and I sat there like that. And my son, my 8-year-old son, came out of his bedroom at that time and he stood by me. He could see me crying and he said, "I love you, Mum." And that was it. And I knew then that I think that was the turning point when I knew I had to take off in a different direction,
Yeah,
you know,
because
with my life. Yeah.
you had to
It just,
heal.
yeah, it was just really simple, but just, and then an interesting thing was that about 3 days later, I happened to be working with children at that time, children who were wards of the state. So I was working in a place where these children lived, and I had a circle of 11-year-old girls I was working with, and we were talking away. It was just a real pleasant, little group we had. And suddenly, in the middle of that group, it was suddenly like for a moment in time stopped, and I felt this shower of gold just pouring over me. And I thought, they're going to wonder what's happening to me. And it was like that moment, and I knew that was Jesus, and the gold just pouring over me. It was just a comforting feeling. And from that change, when I'd looked in the mirror and seen myself for what I was, and then he was saying it's okay. And that's when, I really started moving. Again, it's really hard to explain these moments, but they're
They're not I know. I mean,
yeah.
I've actually just experienced something similar just the other night. Have you ever heard of somatic breathing, like
Yes.
therapy?
Yes.
Tatiana, the yoga instructor, does it, and
Yeah.
I had a healing session with her on Monday night, so it was just a couple nights ago. And at the end, it was just like just this something just came
Yeah.
over me
Yeah.
and I like reached out and I grabbed her hand, just so she could hold my hand while this whole thing just like came through. And it was
Yeah.
like, if there's ever a question that there's something else better than right here, that
Yeah.
question was answered for
Yes,
me. It was
exactly the same here.
quite
Yeah.
beautiful.
Yeah, so many things we can't describe. I can try and paint them.
You can paint them, you
Or
can write
write
about them,
write about
you can
them.
feel
Yeah.
them.
Yeah.
But what's interesting that you said about the dragon in your basement, which turned out to be your soul, is emotions. And
Yes,
that's
my
something I've been
emotions.
playing with a lot lately and listening to and reading about is that our emotions are our true guidance system. Up
Yeah.
here is for lack of a better word, but like really tuning into how do I feel right now
Yeah.
and going towards the things that make you feel good and being brave enough when things don't feel good
Mm.
to stop and turn. So I love that you kind of made that connection as well.
Well, that's it. As I said, I just finished the second one, which is at the print shop right now, but it's not quite finished. I know there's going to be a third one, and I'm not quite sure what it is. And even in the studio with my painting, I'm feeling a change. I'm changing what I want to do and express. So I, I'm going to go back to fabrics again. I think
Hmm.
dealing with fabric because I did that from young with all the costuming, but I just love to work with fabrics too. So
So you returning to yourself.
yeah, probably. Yeah, I don't know what's going to happen, but we'll see.
Yeah, we never do.
Yeah.
And what advice do you have for young girls that want to be artists, that want to be independent? Because you've lived independently as an artist. I am also living independently as an artist.
Yeah.
Like, what kind of advice would you give somebody?
Well, a lot of what I I think, especially if you're like the age of going to college, finished high school and going to college, I'd say take a break and travel. Go and visit other countries. You can do it cheaply. You can belong to the Youth Hostel Association. You can stay in hostels. You can, take your bicycle and bicycle around the world. And I've met many people doing that. When I used to, when I was young, I hitchhiked through Europe and that, as well as traveling and working through Europe. But it's meeting the local people, being invited into the homes, and you get to know these other cultures and other people and realize that we're all the same. Doesn't matter what country you're in, what your religion is, what your culture is, but we're all underneath that. We're human beings, who just want to love each other, want to raise our kids and have food to eat and somewhere to sleep, somewhere to be human. Yeah.
It really is that simple.
So for me, I would my advice would be travel.
Yeah. Don't stress about it and just go travel. I mean,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, and don't be afraid to try new things.
Yeah.
What?
I think that for me, I always wanted to be an artist, but I never thought I could be an artist. So I went to nursing school, but then became a massage therapist. And all the while, you're never really truly in something when you're
Right?
always
Yeah,
dreaming
that's
about this
true.
other life, and you might as well just do the life you dream
Yeah,
of and see what happens.
yeah. I've always loved those artists who knew who they were right from the beginning. Someone like Picasso and that, and weren't afraid to paint what they wanted to paint, and you know, I- they're kind of an inspiration to look at people like that who weren't afraid, just knew what they wanted to do. But, it's, we make those decisions and often words, I mean, I can remember when I was doing my teaching degree, and part of it was my second subject was art, teaching art. But I knew it was hard to make a living being a painter. That was my perception.
Hmm.
And I said to myself, well, I, I can't be an artist. I can't make my living as an artist, so I have to teach, you know. And it's been difficult to change that decision that I made that I can be an artist,
Yeah.
which is what I'm trying to do now.
Yeah. I think you
Yeah,
are, fair to
yeah.
say, an artist.
Well, I have. When I think about it, I have been all of my life, and I just didn't realize it.
Right. Right.
But so now, I've got a few years left, I hope, and I will do my best to not be afraid to try new things.
Right. And continue on your own healing journey
Yeah,
because we're never really healed. At least,
right.
well, are we?
No.
Okay. Darn it.
No, I'm still trying to get rid of the veils, the certain veils.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Is there anything else you'd like to add? I'm gonna put in the actual podcast, how people can find you, and all that stuff. But as we've been talking, is there anything that kind of popped up for you that you would like to share?
But no, just don't be afraid.
Yeah.
Um, don't be afraid to try different things, and even if the people around you think it's crazy, yeah, just try it out. And if it works, it works. If it doesn't, it doesn't. You can try something else.
Yep. I agree.
It's not the end of the world if something fails or something doesn't work. First, when my family, not my parents, but my aunts and uncles knew I was coming to America, and I had a little 10-month-old baby with me. They couldn't understand. You're going to America, but you got a baby. What about school? I said, "Well, I think they've got schools in America." You know, they hadn't they had a completely different concept of what America was like, you know, and I don't know. It's so It's, again, they were afraid,
Yeah.
you know.
There was their own fears.
Yeah, they were afraid, but I wasn't. I was looking forward to it,
Yeah.
and we hadn't planned to stay here. We were planning to get the doctorate and then come back to England or go back to Africa where my husband was from South Africa, but so we ended up staying
Yeah.
in
And did he stay here as well?
yeah,
Okay.
yeah, so
All right. Well, thank you so much
oh,
for being here.
yeah.
And audience, thank you so much for
Thank
tuning
you.
in.
Thank you
And
for sharing with me. Yeah,
yeah, this was
it's good.
awesome. I knew it was going to be great.